Hello again and welcome back. So yeah, today we're exploring audio technology. Like I said, this is part of a bigger project. So in this bigger project, I don't want to cover all the aspects of building a lit app today because we've already done that together and it was fun, but I'm not about to rehash the past here. What I want to do is I want to peel off like specific technologies that we're going to use in this application and kind of learn how to use them standalone, and then talk about how we can bring them together with reactive controllers. Most of those technologies are audio related. I love playing around with audio and video stuff. But then, of course, we talked to Cassandra and we talked all about style as well. So there's some styling aspects to this, styling web components, but there's a lot of audio stuff. So let's get started with the first audio technology, and that first one is Web MIDI. I love Web MIDI, but unfortunately, it's not available in all the browsers, right? So now the other thing to do is just scroll through this documentation. Honestly, there's not much to this. So you can get access to the MIDI port. I have my MIDI port. It's running through a USB MIDI adapter. So it's coming off my keyboard as a MIDI cord, a MIDI plug, and it goes right through USB and into my computer. But as we go further, scrolling down through this documentation, it doesn't seem that complicated. We can listen for MIDI messages and list all the inputs. Like if we had multiple MIDI devices, we could listen for all of them. So this is great. This seems easy. So let's just get started with a simple example and see how well it works. Now you'll notice I did sneak a file in here. It's called Note.js. A while ago, and I'm talking maybe a decade ago, I wrote some music theory JavaScript classes. I converted them over to like more modern ES6 classes for this project, but there's some music theory here, and we kind of need a little bit of music theory to identify notes and how they're related to each other. So I have the most useful stuff I hear is just this array listing all these notes. So this is mostly what we're going to be using for this specific aspect. And of course, any good demo starts with an empty HTML page. So let's get that going. And yeah, we should title this. So let's call it MIDI demo. So in the ultimate project, these are going to kind of be drop-in global controllers that will be reactive controllers, but we don't need to go there next. Let's just get MIDI working. But to start this off with, let's create a JavaScript file for MIDI, midi.js. And the first thing to add to this class is, I'm going to import that note to know what my music theory notes are, and then I'm just going to export the MIDI controller as a class here. So we can go inside our MIDI demo and do a import for that. So script type equals module, because we are using ES modules. And then source equals MIDI.js. Now the cool thing here is that we are using relative paths thus far, so we don't need node module resolution quite yet. We're not doing anything complicated here. So no web dev server yet, nothing that intense. And so I want to start off with a few static members of this class. Everything's going to be static. It's not going to be instance-based at all. This is all going to be used statically for now. Until we get to that awesome reactive controller stuff, it's all going to be static, I should say. And so these properties, we're just starting off with some simple things. We're starting off with the MIDI object that comes back from the browser. And I'm going to make some simple kind of kludgy event listeners in this class. And that's where this array is where they're going to be stored. And then we have the inputs. So each MIDI device that you're listening to is an input. Of course, I only have one MIDI device available to me, so I'm only ever going to see one thing in this array. And then the notes. We can play multiple notes at the same time, or one note, whatever it is. But this array is going to hold the current notes that are being held down at this very moment. And while we're getting the simple things out of the way, let's add our event listener functions. So we have add listener. You register your own function that takes a callback, and we push that onto our note listeners array. Real simple here. Now we can get to some good MIDI stuff. So the first MIDI related function I want to add here is refresh connection. So this refresh connection function, it's my own function. It's globally accessible anywhere in your project. What it does is it returns a promise, and that promise kind of hinges on this navigator.request MIDI access. So this is the Web MIDI API right here. So we're asking our browser, hey, I want to request some MIDI access for us, and when it is successful, it says, hey, here's a MIDI object for you to work with. And if it's not successful, of course, if our browser doesn't support MIDI, or I think if you don't have a secure connection and you're not on localhost, it's also going to fail because everything browser related seems to want to be over a secure connection now. That's where we are. Either way, so if it is successful, that's kind of where the excitement starts, right? It gives us back a MIDI object. And this MIDI object, we're just going to assign it right to our statically available property right here. And we're going to use that object, that MIDI object, and take all the input values from it. And we're going to populate that into our inputs. So we're going to have this inputs right here in our class. It's going to contain every single MIDI device that we could possibly use. This array will only ever see a population of 1 from me. So maybe you have more than 1 MIDI device. Maybe you have tons. So you can work with all of them. But once we see all these inputs come in, I'm going to be a little proactive here. I'm going to be a little assumptive and say, I want the first input in this list, and I'm going to choose this input. So this is our choose input function, and let's just leave it a little bit empty for now. We're going to close up this function right here. So we're choosing an input. What does that mean? Well, what I want to do is I want to take an input and I want to listen for MIDI messages off of that input. However, before we get started with that, let's see if we have something actually working now. So how can we test this out? Well, let's console log a list of all of our inputs. So each of these inputs come with a handy ID property on them. So what I want to say is if the item ID equals the ID we're passing in to this function here, then this is the one we want to choose. This is the one we want to listen for events for. So let me console log that as well. So now we can actually use this MIDI controller in our demo page. So let's do another script tag here. Script type equals module. And then open this up and say import MIDI controller from MIDI. So there we go. And of course, we added a function, MIDI controller dot refresh connection. So the very first thing it's going to do when this thing loads up, it's going to ask for the connection, the MIDI connection, and try to find all the inputs it can. So let's try this out. Remember, we don't have to use Web Dev Server here because we're not doing a node module resolution. It'll just work in our browser because we're using modules. Now, as we load our page here, it is blank, but that's just because we're console logging stuff. So we need to open up our dev tools. All right, so right away, we get the inputs. So we can see in our input list, we have this Emu Systems Incorporated. So this is actually the brand of the cheapo, the USB MIDI adapter I got. So you don't see my Korg X3 coming through, you just see the MIDI adapter. So we know that's plugged in. Now, because this controller is gonna go into a larger application, I'm gonna add a few more convenience methods. So I'm gonna add one method right here that says get inputs. So it's just gonna list our MIDI controller inputs. And so I can say MIDI controller dot inputs, and it's gonna give me all my devices. And in the menu I have in my app, I can, just list them all out with as a repeated menu and be able to choose whatever device I want. Now, I'm sure what we're most interested here is when a note goes up or down. So when I press the key on the keyboard, when I press it, that's note down. When I release it, that's note up. And these functions, they don't do much for Web MIDI. We're gonna get to that with the MIDI message. What these functions do is, like this first one, on note down, it checks if the note is already in the array, in the notes array. If it is not, it's gonna push that note and it's gonna sort the notes and then fire off a listener. So we'll add, you saw we added those listeners. We're gonna use those listeners and get a callback for when the note is down or up. Now the parameters we're getting here are just the notation. So it could be a C, a D sharp, whatever. And the octave, so that's either like the third or the fourth octave. And then the same thing with note up, but we really want these things to fire. So we're gonna get into the MIDI message side right here. Now, I chose to implement this as a closure right in this function here in choose input. So instead of I chose this specific input, I'm gonna say item.onMIDI equals event as an arrow function. Every MIDI event comes with some data. So I can get the data from the event. We're also getting the note. So each key on the keyboard or each note on another instrument is going to be numbered. So we're going to get that number from the. I didn't mention that this is all an array of data. So it is kind of hard to work with and know what you're getting. So with this data, with this array, I just have to know that this first item is the type of event we're getting, and the second item is the note we're getting. And I'll also add for good measure, it might be nice to know the velocity or how hard you do press that note. So I'm commenting it out here because we honestly don't need it within, in this application where it really doesn't matter how hard you press the note, but it is a cool bit of information we might want to know. So that is the third item in this array. Now, when I get this note, it's not very helpful to know that it's note 60 on your keyboard, right? So we're gonna mod the note. So figuring out what note that is, it doesn't matter what octave it is yet, because the octave is what we're capturing next here. So here we have the notation, we got the octave. So if I hit a C sharp, in the middle it'd be a C sharp and the octave would be 4. As the final step, we're going to take action on the notation and octave and the type of event. So I happen to know that an event type that's numbered 144 is a note down. And I also happen to know that a type of 128 is a note up. So I guess that didn't seem very hard. So let's go back to our demo HTML here and listen for those events. So MIDI controller dot add listener. It's going to be an arrow function, and we're going to take we're going to just console log e dot notation and e dot octave. So that should be the data that's coming back to us, and yeah, let's try this out. So I hit middle E, so that's the 4th octave. I'll hit one down below here. That should be a 3. Yep. I'll hit one up high. That's a 5. And these are all up and down messages. So if I could, I'll do a bunch at once. I'll do a C chord, and you can see C, E, G are all down, and then I'll release them all at the same time. And they're all up now. So this is really responsive. Look at how fast these messages are coming in. And that's really all there is to using MIDI, at least for the purposes of this application we're making, where we're listening to keyboard input. Now, just as a final note, this data object, why is it an array like this? Why can't it be more to the point? Why can't it be like a key value pair of different things in a dictionary that are properly labeled? MIDI is capable of so much, and just limiting it to, I press a key and I want to listen to it, that's not nearly what it's capable of doing. So that's kind of why this array is just so generic, just because it can do so much. But yeah, I'll leave it at this. We're gonna move on to pitch detection next, and that's a little more complicated, but it is really cool, honestly. So stay with me.